Right. Lovely. So make yourself comfortable. Let's get rid of this because. So as always, just starting with our little tapping exercise, rubbing your hands together, and then once your fingers have warmed up a little bit, tapping very gently over your face. Like everything we do in Tai Chi, this is a mind-body thing. It draws your attention into your body, it focuses you into your body, over your head and your neck. And down to one shoulder. The other side. And then the upper part of your chest. Your belly. And then your legs. So, sitting back, there's still this sort of idea of drawing in. We spend a great deal of our lives looking outwards. There's nothing wrong with that. We're part of a society and so on and so forth. But just taking some time out from that, so noticing your posture, noticing your weight, your breathing, and even just recalling the feeling of doing Tai Chi, of that sense of being in your body, in that space that we begin to get a feeling for. It's quieter, stiller, however you label it to yourself. Notice the rhythm of your breathing. Do not disturb notice on my door. Carry on. So you breathe in. Maybe noticing any disruption to your breathing if you're a bit tight in your chest or something like that. I'm looking to be able to focus your breathing into your belly. So using these muscles around the navel, the waist, that kind of area, down a bit further down, expanding there to draw your in-breath in. So much easier to do when you're sitting back and you've got this support. It becomes more difficult when we come to the upright position, but at least, again, you can sort of register this as something to recall. And then bringing your feet in, coming to the upright position. So as soon as we do this, just think about the breathing again for a moment, but it's significant to other things. As soon as we come upright, we tend to fall into the habit of stiffening up in our shoulders, our back, and around our belly. We draw our belly in and so on and so forth. So obviously that's going to have an impact on our breathing. We shouldn't be forcing the breath any more than we should be forcing anything else in Tai Chi. So once again, going through this process, feeling your weight sinking down, releasing some of the need in the upper part of your body for that tightening, a little bit of your weight forwards, and aware of the support that your feet and your hips are giving you. Finding a good angle for your upper body. As always, if your back's stiff, then consider sitting back so the lower part of your back is supported by the chair, or maybe put a cushion or something there just to give you that little bit of extra support. Don't sit there and strain thinking it'll be okay at some point, because we want to get that feeling, particularly in the upper body, of a certain amount of space and the tightening will obviously reduce that space. And we want space for, again, the breathing, but for all the internal processes, including the flow of energy, for everything to work, for muscles to work well, without the feeling that somehow by doing one thing we're straining against something else. So that a general sense you might describe as harmony developing within your body. And then starting to turn your head. This initial series of exercises are useful, obviously, for one reason, to identify areas that are tight and to just maybe loosen up those joints a little bit, those parts of the body. But also for seeing the effect that trying to move has on that feeling of space in the body. Often the way of moving is actually something that creates tension, especially if if you've had an injury to your neck, or if you're a bit stiff in your neck. The temptation is to push against it. But think of it the opposite way around. You're trying to encourage a movement there. So although it's clearly a form of exercise, Tai Chi is sometimes described as a kind of self-massage. So this gives us a different perspective on movement and how we approach movement. One thing that I've mentioned quite a lot that I find quite useful and I think is important is to just feel that when that tightness and that stiffness starts to release, we're not left just hopeless and unable to move or even to sit up, that there is a source of strength, a source of movement, somewhat deeper in the body that we can gradually become aware of and begin to work with. And then your shoulders. Another thing, again, which I've mentioned quite a lot, is to notice that when we're, say, focusing our attention on our shoulders, if we can just expand our attention out a bit, we realize that it's not just the shoulders that are involved in this movement. Chest and upper back are very much a part of it as well, going forwards. And maybe not just chest and upper back, but whatever is there for you to notice. And in the process of noticing, just somehow bringing those movements, those elements more into practice. And then hands out to your sides. And what I find is that I may come across an exercise that just emphasizes a certain way of moving, and then I begin to find that popping up in other exercises. So recently I learned an exercise that actually emphasizes a sort of certain contraction in the sides of the body. And since doing that, I've started to notice elements of that in movements that I hadn't really registered that it was going on before. So just a general build up of awareness. And bring your hands up. And once again, we have three elements, as you might think of it. We have the physical aspects of posture and the mechanics of the movement. We have an awareness of what's going on within our body. We have the movement itself, the flow, the momentum, the energy, however you care to think about it, all interacting. And then back the other way. They all interact, they all influence each other, they all benefit from this. Rest your hands, easing forwards. And I think that interaction, that harmonization of those three elements is most noticeable in those movements that we are familiar with. And so this is one of the reasons why we focus on building up sequences, routines of movements. We repeat the movements, we repeat the sequences in order and so on and so forth. It's good to learn new exercises for various reasons, but it's also good to have that sense of coming back to something that is familiar. It takes away the sort of immediate questions of what's he doing here, you know, what does that hand do, and so on and so forth. We're able to, if you like, get beneath the surface of the exercises. So here, very simple, but a very important movement, our weight moving, the way that we use our legs, the springiness in the legs, the compression and expansion. And then we start to maybe feel that a little bit in the lower part of our back as well. Notice how that movement moves up the body, expands up into our back and then into the front of the body, and will eventually be the movement, the primary movement that makes our arms move. Turn towards one leg. A turn is initiated in your hips, then your waist. Not a big movement, so you're not twisting right around. You're only going towards one knee. So as you sit, your knees tend to sort of angle out a little bit. Your legs angle out, your knees are there, and it's as though you're just trying to go down, touch your nose to your knee. You almost certainly won't get that far, but that's the direction that you're moving in. So yeah, that's not a big angle. Turn the other way. But you'll notice that, you know, obviously your shoulders follow that movement. So again, we have that connection from the center of the body to our shoulders and eventually to our arms. And we feel that here as we go around in a circle, the spine just floating in your back. Think of a plant floating in water, just supported by the water, but not held tight. And if you move too far, if you go right out here, then that stiffening would take place. So you will get more movement from the outside, but you'll impinge on this sense of internal movement. And back the other way. Good. And then settle down again. About a third of your weight in your legs, and just pull one knee up and lower down. And when you pull the knee up, of course, you raise your heel. Try not to use your shoulders or your back. It's really quite a small movement. So it's this area here around top of your legs, your hips, buttocks, that kind of area. That's the part that's really active. The rest of your body is just gently held in position. And then you lift, you flex your ankles, so you raise your toes, you step out and back. So with a minimum of disruption to the upper part of your body, you'll feel sort of things happening in your lower back. And then put that foot down, try that on the other side. Notice any difference between one side of your body and another. And if you've got a problem with a hip or a knee or something like that, then that will be quite a significant change. Remember that the key thing is we're always looking to soften in the body, not to stiffen and strain. And then lift, flex your toes and push out. One more time. So that idea of achieving the movement not through straining but through softening is unusual and is different to a lot of other forms of exercises. At first it seems as though, well, you know, what's the point of this? Remember with Tai Chi, we sort of measure our progress over weeks, months and years, not at 5-minute intervals or something like that. It's a gradual change that is produced in the body. The whole process is quite an old one. It comes, Tai Chi comes from China, and one of the old Chinese classics called the Tao Te Ching has this lovely couple of lines in it that is talking, it's using the image of the sea hitting against the cliff. It says the sea will always fall back from the cliff, but it will always come back and will eventually wear the cliff away. So this is a gradual kind of evolution. So if, for instance, you know, you've got that bit of pain in your knee, I'm not suggesting that the pain would necessarily go away, but gradually by toning the body in the appropriate way, we can actually do a movement like, say, this with less strain on the knee. It's not an easy process to do. It takes a while, but it's part of the ongoing process in Tai Chi. So sitting with your weight mostly back, 2/3 of your weight back, hands slightly out, palms of your hands facing forwards, tilt forwards, and just let your hands rotate around in the way that they did a little bit earlier. And really just observing the link, the connections between two movements that we did earlier, one being the movement of the weight, and the other being this rotation of the shoulders. And so the area to focus on once you've got the weight movement and the basic rotation in your arms is that area between your hips and your shoulders, including the upper back and chest and ribs and so on. And just seeing what's happening there and seeing how it just quite naturally begins to link up with the rest of the movement. And again, we need a softness in the body. It's as though there are pathways of movement through the body that involves muscles, nerves, fascia, the pattern of movement itself. But those pathways can get choked, they can get overgrown, and that often happens when we are tight and we are stiff. So again, another reason for that softness, to allow a sort of natural pattern of movement to emerge. It's time from the forward position. Keep your hands facing backwards and going into fisherman castanet. Just as you feel your spine floating a little bit in your back, so there's that same feeling, the bones of your arms and your hands and your fingers. No muscle completely stiff. That kind of softness in the muscle, a bit like the sort of steel cables you might see on a suspension bridge. You don't see them taut, you don't see them out tight. They always seem to have these little curves in them. And then imagine the ball in front of you, holding your arms in position and just using the backward movement to draw your arms over the ball. The image of pulling your arms over the ball may help. Try not to stiffen up in your shoulders, but rather, again, focus on what's happening between your hips and your shoulders up through the front of your body. Your hips always dropping back into the chair, so always that stable feeling coming from the rooting down. When your arms are pulled over, your elbows are soft, not tight. And then this time I'm going to change to pigeon spreads its wings. Again, elbows hanging down. So initially when we start to do a movement, the immediate effect is usually felt in, say for instance with this one, you'll feel it in the triceps and biceps, the muscles at the top of the arm. As you get more used to the movement, as you practice it and those muscles condition, so they get to a point where they're not having to strain and to stiffen up simply to do this movement. And that seems to allow the effort to percolate into the body a little bit deeper, like water soaking down into the ground. And eventually that will sort of feel as though it's getting to your bones. Bones are, of course, living tissue. And so the load, the effort, becomes distributed more evenly through your body. Still, of course, these movements, your ribs and your chest. There's a saying in Tai Chi that goes, when one part of your body is in motion, your whole body is in motion. It's obviously not literally true, but what it means is that any one movement that we make goes deep into the body and is spread wide through the body. The factors influencing it are spread wide and deep. And then pushing a wave, this gives us a stronger movement. And if we use this image of pushing against water, that encourages that, if you like, a kind of sense of total effort, not just your arms, not even just your weight moving. Though both of those are there, but just feeling how using the image programs your body to move in a slightly different way. It's a good example of the importance of our awareness while we're doing these things. One more time. Hands loosely fisted. Now this time go back to pigeon spreads its wings, putting these last three movements together, feeling the flow of the movement from one to another. And just letting your attention stay with that flow. So even if you get a movement wrong, it's already happened. It's too late to do anything about. Just bring your attention back to this movement right now. This movement, this part of the movement, whatever it is you're experiencing, whether it's the rhythm, the effect on different parts of the body, the breathing, the image. So not only your body experiencing that space from the tightness and the stiffness, but again, the mind also experiencing a little bit of space, totally engaged in what's happening at this point, right here and now, not still thinking about what you saw in the news or whatever. One more time, one more round with this little sequence of three. So the sequences, when we put things in together in the sequence, can be quite testing. You'll almost certainly get it wrong. You'll go too quickly or do the wrong movement or something like that. That's fine. That's not a failure in that sense. Now this time change it. And we're going to change. And now we come to the vertical movements. So a gentle push down through your feet and your hips. And again, just aware of the changes, the back and belly and up into your solar plexus, chest. Try not to strain in your shoulders or your arms. Just again, looking for that different approach, different way of moving. But expanding, contracting. Those areas that feel tight or stiff, you can just imagine them being very gently massaged by the movement, gradually released. Might also want to think about, say, your posture. For instance, that tightness is in your shoulders. Are you sitting in such a way that is creating that tightness, or can you come back to a posture where you feel more support from your feet and your hips, so there's less need for the shoulders to stiffen up? And then hands out to your sides. and then parting the clouds. Now, dragon plucks the stars from the sky. Again, one more on each side. And then pushing in two directions. So this space in both body and mind, I think, is one of the most useful elements that we get from Tai Chi, one of the most useful benefits in Tai Chi. It relates to meditational arts like mindfulness as much as it does to any form of exercise. Gradually, we begin to be able to maintain some of that space in our everyday activities, or at least come back to it. And if you think about this exercise, as you push your arms up and as you push your arms out, so you're more likely to stiffen up, but we always come back. There's always a point here where we're right back in the center, and we push out, maybe get a bit tight across the shoulders, and again, always coming back. And that rhythm is a very natural rhythm, and again, it really emphasizes both sides of the circle, not just the outward aspect. And we can apply that to all sorts of elements in our daily lives. As I say, we do engage one way or another with the world around us. But sometimes that can be a little bit overwhelming, a bit stressful, even when it's something quite positive. And so if we become aware of this rhythm, we become aware of those moments when we're able to come back into a more centered, a quieter space. Both the outward and the inward movement are important. And then as you push out this time, turn a little bit. And this really emphasizes the significance of that middle part of your body, by which I mean the area of your hips and your waist. It's like the movement expands out from there, returns to there, and from there down into the ground. And our attention is inevitably drawn back to that lower part of the body. So we begin to be able to develop an actual physical location for that quietening of the mind. One that becomes a little bit hardwired into our nervous system. A particular pathway, the more we use it, like any pathway, the more it becomes accessible. If you've got a shed in your garden and you haven't been out there all winter, when you go to your shed in the spring, it will be overgrown, a bit muddy, a bit inaccessible. But if you walk that path every day, it's more likely to be clear, more likely that you'll be able to navigate it successfully. Now, put one foot out, scooping the sea and looking at the sky. And then roll your hands into loose fists, sit back and grasp in the tiger's ears. And then roll the foot forwards. And then hands fisted. One more time. So that first set of exercises that we do right up to this point, they're relatively straightforward. They're simple exercises, although there's a great deal going on in them, and that's quite deliberate and quite intentional. Every school of Tai Chi that I know has a set of exercises that it does that are very simple. they'll often also have these very complex forms and so on and so forth. But in order to understand what is going on in the complex forms, inevitably they will turn to the simpler exercises, because they're the ones where we can get beneath the surface. So the more complex exercises, the more involved sequences and so on and so forth, are almost a kind of testing ground, I suppose. Can we maintain those principles when there's a little bit more pressure? So, obviously, when we go out into our lives, it's one thing to sit here in Tai Chi sessions, all nice and calm and so on and so forth, and then you go back into the rest of your life and suddenly everything is going on again. The question is, how can we maintain that space, that rhythm, that flow, that kind of quietness of the mind? It's very challenging. So the more complex exercises are quite a good way of actually beginning that process. And what we find is that those attributes of stillness, of space, calmness, and so on and so forth, are the things that help us to negotiate the more complex patterns. So we're going to do part in the Wild Horses Mane, one of the more complicated ones that we do in these sessions. Start by just, again, moving your weight forwards and backwards towards one leg. And what you're going to do is, as you go forward, I'll exaggerate. I'm turning too far. I'm twisting my back up. I don't want you to do that. But it's almost like you're sort of pushing into something with your shoulder and then turning and back. So imagine, for instance, that if you were standing, there was a door there and you were pushing into that door. You maybe had a cup in your hand or something like that, and you're just pushing through the door to create a space. Your hand on that side is palm up in front of your belly. And so, continuing the image, you're pushing through a door, you create the space, and then you just slide your hand through that space. And then you come back, you sink down again, and then do the same thing again. You extend out, and you come back. Your hand comes up to just below shoulder height, so your fingers are just below or at shoulder height. And if you look, my arm is more or less a mirror image of my knee, of my leg at that point. As I go forward, it's just a little bit of expansion here as well. It's a movement often connected with chest and lungs. So all those little elements of movement that we've noticed work together to produce this movement. Try that on the other side. You may feel the difference between one side and the other. In particular, if you're strongly left or right-handed, you may feel that it's better on one side than another. That isn't necessarily true, by the way. It can feel like that. But I remember being with one of my teachers once. I'm left-handed, and we were doing an exercise, and he said, "Which side feels better?" And I said, "Well, this side, because I'm left-handed." So that's interesting, he said, because it looks to me like it's better on the other side, which was interesting. And in any case, remember, a lot of the movement takes place before it reaches that side and that hand. So now, one movement at a time, one stage at a time, in that moment, if you like to think of it like that, you leave your hand at shoulder height, you come back into this other side, and you turn your hands in to hold a ball. Now you move across. Sink down into this hip, and you go forwards, you push with your shoulder, you create the space, and at the same time, you push the hand down. You don't need to remember these movements. You want to be able to follow the movement as I do them. One movement leads to another. And so the key thing is to remember, as my first teacher constantly used to say to us, that the seed of the next movement is in the movement that you're doing. So your best chance of getting the next movement correct is to focus and be as correct as possible on this movement, not to try and think, oh, is it going to be left hand or right hand? Have I got to do this or that? Just stay in that space that comes with that focusing of attention, that focusing of your physical movement into this one moment. And we move from moment to moment in that way, like flowing down a stream, flowing down a river on a boat. So part in the wild horse's mane. One more time. And again, rubbing your hands together. And then tapping over your face. Over your head and neck. Down to one shoulder. And your arm. The other side. The upper part of your chest. Belly. And your legs. Good. And then stand. So people sometimes say to me, well, how do you remember all this? And I don't, to be honest. Well, it's not in the sense that we normally think of as memory. I mean, I've learned a lot of different movements and some sequences of movements. One sequence that I practice regularly lasts half an hour. There's 80 or so movements in there. I don't remember them. If you said to me, what's the 51st movement of that form, I wouldn't have a clue. But one movement leads to another, and it's a bit like how we remember where our kitchen is or where the bathroom is. If you've got a guest in your house and you're in the living room and they say, can I just use the bathroom? You say, yeah, what you've got to do, and then you have to stop and think, don't you? Well, how do you get to the bathroom? And actually, quite often what we do is say, here, I'll show you, because it's easier to show you, because it's hardwired into a kind of muscle memory or body memory. I live on Mill Road in Cambridge, and we're not far from the train station, and we get a lot of people coming up and down Mill Road who aren't local. Sometimes they're from other countries, so their English isn't great, and you get stopped on the street, and it's like they'll ask you for the train station. So next time you're somewhere and somebody says, do you know the way to such and such? Try putting your hands in your pocket and talking to them and not moving. What you'll find is somebody says, well, do you know how to get to the bus station? And you go, yeah, what you do is you go, that we rehearse the movements in our body. We don't remember up there, we remember patterns of move. There's a certain amount of obviously of information that we store, but the body is an important part of it, and it's that element that we're accessing. So I'm not suggesting to you that you remember, oh yes, I must come into my center, but rather get into the habit of coming into your center in the way that we always do in Tai Chi. So standing and sinking down, we settle down. and we push up and that, up and out, and eventually we're just drawn back in to the feet, the hips, the center of the body, and then that too changes and we start to push out again, like the in-breath changes to the out-breath. So every few moments, we just touch that quieter space. It reminds me a little of the sort of things that we do quite naturally and quite ordinarily. You're walking down the road, you've just been in a shop, and you just check that you picked up your wallet or your purse or your bag. Things like that. So this is not some kind of strange foreign process. This is something that we do. It's just that we're applying it in a very particular way. Change to the wild goose. Memory too is an important element here. We remember that it's possible to access that quiet space, that stillness. And then part in the clouds. Just let yourself settle again for a moment. Shake out. This is what my first teacher used to mean when she told us that we would find ourselves standing like this in supermarket queues. Not that we would start doing Tai Chi in the supermarket queues, the movements and so on, but that we would, in a sense, come back to that space because it's becoming more familiar to us, like putting on an old pair of shoes. Now, put one foot forwards and transfer your weight. As always, weight transfer is very important. We want to really feel that we're sinking in to each leg. That too becomes a habit. People report back to me that they're walking down the road and suddenly realised I was walking differently, or standing at the bus stop and found myself rooting down. So that on a physical level, things like the root, the flow of the movement, the softness of the body, less strain on different parts of the body, become part of how we habitually move. And then your arms following. Good. And on the other side, first of all, just transferring your weight. Again, remember, try not to stiffen up in your knees. You will find it very strong. The muscles of your legs, as I said, as they condition, you'll find that they will still be working, don't get me wrong, but you'll find that the load is increasingly distributed through your legs. And then fisherman cast to net. Good. And shake out. So go back to your chairs. I think this element of Tai Chi, this, if you like, meditational aspect, is actually really important to us because it just helps us to negotiate the ups and downs and the ins and outs of everyday life without getting too caught up in, I suppose I talked about sort of floating down the river without getting caught up in the rapids, I suppose you could say. I was very struck by this once when I used to teach for an organisation that supported people who've had head injuries. And I arrived there one day and somebody came up to me. He'd only been to a couple of sessions with me. But he was telling me that one of his symptoms of his head injury is that he got panic attacks. And he was describing how he'd been on a Saturday in the centre of Cambridge by the bus station. And he felt a panic attack coming on, not surprisingly, given what it's like down there. And he said, no, that could be quite serious, obviously. Kind of the consequences of that in that kind of situation. And he said he suddenly remembered how he'd felt during the Tai Chi session. And I think for him it was to do with breathing, but it could be lots of things that we cover. And so what he did was, he said what he did was he went into the park behind the bus station, found somewhere to sit down and just sat down comfortably, remembered the Tai Chi stuff and closed his eyes and remembered the breathing. And he said the panic attack just went away. It just didn't, well, it never happened. It just sort of dispersed. And it was, again, rather than getting kind of caught up in the rapids, if you like, he was able to come back to this sense of space and quietness in this moment. And I don't mean to suggest that we shouldn't be looking ahead or even behind or whatever, but we shouldn't do so at the expense of being where we are now. And coming back to this, whether it's by the bus station or in the supermarket queue, or when you feel as though you've been watching too much television or whatever. I mean, whatever the circumstances, just as a little bit of a release from those things. So Embrace Tiger, return to the mountain. Different images you can use, but for me, the mountain encapsulates some of these ideas of stillness, space, and strength as well, which I think is important. So let your hands come down. We embrace tiger. In this context, I think the tiger is just everyday life for us, really. But we come back. We embrace the tiger. We come back into that space. One more time. And rest. Lovely. Thank you very much. And another characteristic, I think, of that space is how quickly the time can pass. It seems to have just shot by today, and yet it felt, for me at least, I felt very quiet in it. So I hope you did too. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
And,
Take care, everybody.
as always, feel free to contact me.